1 minute. Yeah, I can move this end here.
Has a mind of its own today.
I know.
Thank you.
Does that feel stable?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't want your coffee to spill. Ooh, got some green stuff there.
Veggies. Gotta love it.
All right, let's begin this morning. I was checking to see how many of you were wearing green today. So I see there's a few of you. And we're all Irish today, aren't we? I actually did my DNA testing, and I knew that my grandfather was English and my grandmother was Swedish on my mother's side, and on my dad's side everybody was German. So I did the DNA and I found out there's also a little bit of Irish in me. And I'm not sure what that means, but you know, the history between the English and the Irish was not pretty, that's for sure. So we could have done an Irish wake today. We could have served Irish whiskey. Might have increased attendance, I'm not sure. But we're going to do it the Lutheran way. Let's begin with prayer. Lord Jesus, as we talk about the topic of mourning today, every one of us has been through that process of mourning. Every one of us has suffered losses. We have all experienced our pain and our struggle. So help us today, Lord, to explore this topic, to see what it means for us, to see what it means for us in terms of how we can minister to those around us who are also mourning. So bless this day, Lord, and help each of us to become good listeners and people who tend to the hearts of others. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we got a bunch of noise out there. I think I'm going to close the door. All the little kids I saw this morning are just all hyper, and I don't quite know what that means, but it must be spring or something. So, yes. You can't hear? Okay. It's showing green. All right. Now we're on. Now we're not on. hope that doesn't mean the battery is going. Okay, there we go. So the writer to Ecclesiastes talks about there is a time for mourning. And as you start to think about that, you have to ask yourself, well, what does that mean? So what is the time for mourning? Is there a set time for mourning? Is there an expanse of time for mourning? And those are all really important questions that I think we want to explore as we look at the subject this morning. I think something that you often hear in the culture in which we live is time is up. Have you ever heard people say, well, that's over, that's done, that's past, don't talk about that? So I think in our culture, there's a fairly strong message that mourning kind of fits into a little period and then it's over. So I really want to explore that with you this morning to see what your understanding of that is, what your experience with that is, and if maybe there's another way of looking at that. So when we think about mourning, what we're talking about is loss, that people have experienced loss. When you look at the screen, you are looking at the graveside. So when we have funerals, the final thing is that we go to the cemetery. And you see the pastor, and he is reading the ritual, which is called the act of committal. And then as that ends, then everybody goes back to the church, or they go back to a luncheon, but then they kind of go back to their life. So that is kind of the final act in terms of what we often experience in our culture. So before we get into the loss that comes with death, I want to mention there are many other losses. We really start experiencing loss even as little children. So maybe some of you remember that there was a time when you put away your toys. And you really loved your dolls. You really loved your toy tractor. But then there came a point where you had to give that up. You had to move on. You had to go on to the next stage. A memory from my childhood is I had a blanket. You know, many kids have something that they cuddle with. They have a stuffed animal. I had this little piece of blanket, and it was kind of in tough shape. It was all ragged and probably didn't smell too good. And I don't remember exactly, but somewhere I got the hint that it was time to let that blanket go. And so I remember that one night I said to myself, all right, this is it. Time to bite the bullet. This blanket's got to go. And my bedroom was on the second floor. So I opened the window, threw my blanket out the window. You know, you got to bite the bullet. Farm people are tough. And it landed on the bridal wreath bushes below. It was probably 4 in the morning. I woke up, and I really needed my blanket. And so I go down the stairs, I go outside, I reach up in the bush, and it's got dew on it, and I had to take my blanket back. So I wasn't quite ready to let that go. So, you know, that is just kind of what happens sometimes as we're growing up. We experience these losses. You know, my parents were like, big deal, it's just a piece of blanket. But for the child, it was a significant thing. So as we go through life, as we graduate from high school, as we graduate from college, as we move on from one job to the next, there are many, many kinds of losses. And maybe in your own experience, you didn't always recognize that. You didn't always stop to think about it. You didn't perhaps mourn that, but it was there, wasn't it? It still was a part of who you were as a person. And you look back at it now, and it's still there, isn't it? As profound as those losses are, the biggest losses, I think, is when someone close to us dies. And why are those losses, when we lose a parent, we lose a sibling, we lose a spouse, why are those losses so profound? Go ahead.
I would say because they profoundly affect your life.
Yeah.
With having, at least in my case, a pet dog that was a part of my existence for almost 16 years.
All right.
And when the day comes when you feel that you have to put this animal down, you really don't want to do it, and you're in some anguish because you know that you have to do it.
Yeah. So really,
Those mixed feelings when you have this pet that has been a significant part of your life. And one of our staff persons, they lost their dog the last week or so, and I went and talked to her the other day, and she expressed similar thoughts to what you're talking about, is that that animal had become such an important part of their family. And so again, the difficulty, you know you have to put this animal down, but your heart is broken as you have to do that. And then I think too, after that, there's that silence, isn't there? You know, so it's feeding time. It's time for the walk. It's time to go to and you know, it's not going to happen because that animal is no longer there. So, you know, pets is certainly one of those times that reminds us of all of the mixed feelings that we have. And so again, to talk about, yeah, go ahead.
With a pet, I get it, and I understand and I agree with all the feelings. But with a person, you don't have a choice. With an animal, there is a choice. And even if you don't like your choices,
yeah.
there's a choice. But with a father, mother, spouse, whatever, you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Get away from you, I think it makes for even, I don't know, sometimes pets are more important than people are at the time. But
Yeah.
there's no choice.
That's really an important point. So with a pet, you do make a choice. With the humans in our life, many, you know, we don't have a choice, do we? So we know they are dying. We sometimes are trying everything we can to keep them alive. We see a lot of that at Fredert, where the doctors are saying we can no longer treat, and the families are still insisting that there has to be another clinical trial, there has to be one more thing. And so, again, this is not a choice. And then that raises another level of pain in our life, because we know they're going. And we don't want that to happen, but we can't stop it, and then they're gone. And sometimes the feeling that we talk about is bereft. And that is really what bereft feels like, isn't it? You couldn't hang on to them. They slipped out of your grasp, and there you are. Okay.
My husband to colon cancer, first you go through the shock,
Yes.
and then it wasn't until after he was gone I understood that two shall become one, because after that I didn't feel whole anymore.
Yeah.
Because you lost that confidant, that helper.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
again, the two becoming one, and now you are separated, and you are just one. And that reminds me of my mother. My dad died of a heart attack, and so again, the suddenness of it. And we came home for the funeral, and Mom was just really, calm, and she was just carrying on, and I was a basket case, and I think my siblings were too, and we're just kind of like, wow. And about a week after, we had all gone back home, and Mom was alone, and there was a light snow, and she went out and just kind of swept off the cement pad, and she came back in, had a little bit of snow on her shoe, and she stepped on the kitchen linoleum, zoop, and her feet went out, and down she came, and her wrist was broken. And she's lying on the kitchen floor, and she's not sure she can get up. She's not sure she can get to the telephone. And I'm thinking she's calling out, "George," and George was not there. And so that was where she experienced that she was alone. This was the new reality. And as you say, the confident, my mom and dad talked about everything. And so now she's got questions about finances, and he was the finance guy, and she can't talk to him about that. And so again, she's getting into this new reality, and it's really, really tough. There was a hand, yeah.
We're entering the season now, culminating in a couple of weeks, where the world loses somebody and they've lost them forever. We're blessed with knowing that we'll see those people again.
Yeah.
So that is a big thing for us, is to know that it's the end, but it's not the end. So we're losing what we had here, but then we say, okay, there is more. But in the meantime, we are still here, aren't we? We are still alone. And so, again, I want to explore that with you this morning. So I want to look, first of all, at our customs of how do we do this? So what is our custom? When someone dies, what are some of the things that we do? How do we address the situation? Who do we call?
All right.
Many times you call the pastor, and the pastor may be there with you at that moment. He may not be able to be with you until after, but that certainly is one thing that we do. We call the pastor. And who else is involved in the arrangements? The funeral director. So very often that is also the other call that is made. So what does the funeral director do? What is their function in the grieving process?
Well, they try and take a lot of the decisions, not decisions, sorry, it's a poor choice of words. Try to help you with making it as easy for you as possible, where you don't have to, like, think critically and whatever else. They kind of reassure you that, they're handling things and taking care of your loved one.
All right, so a major
Job of the funeral director is to take you through the steps. So this is what we need to do for your loved one. This is what we need to do in terms of what kind of service would you like to have, and all of those other decisions that are involved there. So again, because of their experience, they kind of know some of the things that are going on there, and so they kind of take you by the hand and they help you through with that.
You say they serve as a mediator
Yeah.
between different agencies?
All right.
They also are doing that. They're that go-between. So again, they know things, like you have to have a death certificate, And so, you know, who do you contact and who do you take care of in terms of that? So the pastor and the funeral director are kind of two of the key people that are involved in these first days. And I think those of you that have been through it, was it overwhelming to go through all of that?
Well, then you have to call the relatives.
Gotta
All the relatives. So really, I think in those first days, it's kind of a whirlwind of activities. You got to make a ton of decisions. And so as you're doing all these decisions, as you're calling all these people, as you tell them and you hear them breaking down on the phone, and then your own grief begins to kick in and you can't hardly talk on the phone, it's just a whirlwind. So I think for many people, those first days after the death and getting into the funeral and then doing the funeral and the visitation. How many of you stood in a visitation line? Yeah, that's kind of an agony, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, it's beautiful to have people come and be with you and speak to you. And on the other hand, it's like, oh man, I don't know if I can stand for 10 more minutes here. So it's kind of a mixed thing.
I think one of the greatest gifts we can give our loved ones is to pre-plan the funeral, to have the hymnals and the verses, anything that you want already on record at the church,
Yeah.
and to have already made your arrangements with the funeral home.
Yeah.
That takes care of a lot of the things that have to be taken care of at the moment, and that's a real gift.
So,
Planning. How many of you have pre-planned? All right, a goodly number of you have. And I'm among that number also. I think because of my experience as a pastor and seeing all the things that happen when you don't pre-plan, it can get really ugly sometimes because even things like picking the casket, one will want to go cheap and one wants to go expensive, and you know, I know Dad would have wanted the bronze, and the other one's like, no, I think he wanted the pine box. And you know, then it just it's so stressful, and now you also have the contention. So if you plan your own funeral and you pick a pine box, well, then nobody's going to argue about that. They might say, you know, why did he do that? But it was your choice. So I think another aspect of that then too is, as you look at practices today, cremation has become almost like 50% in the funerals that we have now. I personally chose that for myself because I'm cheap. I didn't want this big box that costs thousands to just go in the ground. So I would rather save that money and give that to my kids instead of putting that in the ground.
But I think that this is also part of pre-planning, because, for example, I feel like there's a burden on the people that are left behind
yeah,
to clean graves and keep track of this kind of thing,
yeah,
which to me is still serving the dead in some way,
yeah.
and takes away from time that can be spent better doing other things. And so I'm making a decision similar to yours. I don't want anyone to have to take care of any plot and worry about if the flowers are too dead or whatever, because
Yeah.
I'm not there, so I'm not gonna care about those flowers, you know?
So we kind of get into some real practical things here, don't we? Yes.
My husband cremated mainly because that way I get to keep him with me. But we
Okay.
just
Yeah.
buried my father-in-law, and I was surprised at the cost of renting that casket, because they still wanted the showing,
Yeah,
was as much as buying the casket. So you're not always saving.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I felt it important that people got to see my father-in-law, see my husband, because my pastor out in Missouri said, you need to see the person So you really get it into your head that
Yeah.
they are gone,
Yeah.
so.
You're right about that viewal. So my plan is that there will be a viewal, but not at the visitation. So there'll be a viewal for family only, then we don't have to buy that rental or pay for that rental, but there will be a viewal. I have to admit that with my father, the viewal was I still could not believe it until I saw him in the casket. And I reached out and I touched his hand and I said, oh yeah, he's really gone. So many people who do not have that opportunity, let's say a plane goes down or there's an explosion or there's a war experience, you can see where that again complicates their grief because they still never really got to see. And so there's still a part of them that says, well, maybe they're not. Was there another hand here? No? Okay.
I already forgot one.
Oh, okay.
What is the church's position on cremation versus burial as far as everything gone but the ashes?
Yeah, I don't think our church has a definitive stand on that. But I'm thinking back, maybe 50, 75 years ago, the church was very strong against that. Because at that point in time, there were people who were saying, I'm going to be cremated and have my ashes blown to the winds, and then, God will not be able to, get a hold of me. So that was why Christians were saying, we don't want to say that. But as time has gone on, and as people have gotten more conscious of cemeteries are full, and we're taking up land, and all those kind of things, environmental. And we all know ashes to ashes, dust to dust means that whether you're embalmed or not, eventually you're going to be dust. So all that cremation does is speed up the process. But ultimately, that's the way you're going to end up. So I'm not trying to defy God by being cremated. I'm just, again, looking at the expense. And I want my family to understand that, my soul has gone on. And so, again, you can be thinking about what you're going to say to me when we meet again. And, I want you to have a little speech for me. And maybe you can say some things I've been waiting to hear, and you can tell me then. So other things I wanted to talk about in this regard with the funeral. So we do all of these things, and it all happens in a fairly rapid period of time. Again, it's like a whirlwind, and then we go to the cemetery, we go to the luncheon, everybody goes home, and then what happens? Yeah. And then, as I said with my mother, reality sets in. And then you really begin to think about, what does it mean that I am alone? That person is gone? That I can't pick up the phone? And I found myself doing that with my mother. It was like a month or so after, and I was going to the phone to tell her something, and I realized the phone is not going to get picked up. That number is no longer in service. And it's just like, well, duh. But on the other hand, that really is how it works, isn't it? Those awarenesses, they come to us gradually. They come to us at unexpected moments. They come to us painfully. And so what I want to talk about today is our culture. Once all of this is done and we come back from the cemetery, what does our culture say as far as mourning is concerned? Move on. Okay. People say that right out, don't they? It's time to move on. And why do they want us to move on?
very uncomfortable with the whole thing. And so, I mean, they try to give their respect and stuff, but, it's easier to kind of avoid and not think about it.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. People are uncomfortable. I really want you to stop and think about that at a moment, how uncomfortable people are with loss and with grief. So they see that you are hurting, and then that touches the grief in them, and then they're like, And so rather than look at that and open that and talk about that, they say, move on. I have many of those experiences at the hospital where a patient dies, and I'll come in, and sometimes I haven't been visiting that patient, and so I will say to the family, tell me about your mother. What are some of your favorite memories? And so they will start to bring up the things that their mother taught them, the things that she did for them that they loved. And so often, as the family members are doing this, one of the family members is, well, let's not talk about that. And it just happens over and over again that some families want to enter into that, and other family members leave the room or make that statement like, that's too painful. No, we're not doing that. We're shutting that down. So I think that is very prevalent in our own families and in the culture of which we are a part. On the world news, oftentimes there's somebody famous that dies. And so, David Muir will, bring that up and thanks for the memories and okay. So 5 minutes, all right, we're good. Thank you, and on we go. And I think, again, if we look at the process of mourning, we are missing something if we shut that down, if we stop that conversation that people are starting to have. What we want to do is open that. Let that conversation happen. Let those memories be shared. Yes?
I was going to say, when Ken's dad passed away, our 5 kids all handled mourning and grieving differently. One of them wanted to touch the body, one didn't want to even get nearby.
Yeah.
So kids just handle it so differently.
Yeah. Kids handle it differently, and so do we. So I think you have noticed this too, that we all experience grief in our own way. At Children's Hospital, when a baby would die, the husband would have his way of grieving, the mother would have her way of grieving, and it wasn't uncommon that they would get divorced because, again, they were each grieving in their own way and they could not understand. She was wondering, how come you're not crying? And he was like, I'm crying, but it's inside. And I don't know how to verbalize it. I don't know how to talk about it. And so again, because they're grieving differently. So that's what makes grieving complicated, because we are each grieving in our own way.
I think our culture attaches happiness with goodness. We are supposed to be happy all the time.
All the time.
And when we're sad, well, that's something that's bad. You shouldn't be sad.
Yeah.
You should get rid of sadness just because the good, bad thing. And we don't know how to talk about our emotions. It's just that if you're happy, you're good. If you're sad, we got to do something about it. It has to be fixed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be fixed. We should be free to be sad when there's something to be sad about.
I really like what you're saying about that. The emphasis is on the happy. And for some reason, we think that tears and pain is a negative. And that really isn't biblical. If you look at the experience of God's people, if you go back into Old Testament times, they knew that grief and loss was a part of their life. The Jewish people have a custom called Shiva. How many of you have heard of that? All right, some of you have. So it's basically a 7-day period after death when that's all you do. You just focus on what's happened. And so you don't work, you don't do anything, you just sit there and people come. And the way the Shiva works is that you're not supposed to say anything as the person who's coming. So you do not offer all kinds of flowery condolences and all those kind of things. You sit in silence with the grieving. And you'll see that in Job. His friends came, and for 7 days, they did not open their mouth. Can you imagine being silent for 7 days? Oh, that's a real trick. And that was the best thing they did, because after that, they started talking, and then everything went downhill, because then they were getting on Job's case. But that Shiva is really a beautiful thing. We have a rabbi on our staff, and his mother died kind of unexpectedly, probably, I don't know, 3 years or so ago. And so he told us, as his colleagues, that if we wanted to come, this was how the Shiva worked. And so we went to his house, and we did not say anything. And then he talked about his mother, and his sister talked about her mother. And afterward he said, "You were a good chaplain. You didn't say anything." And so I just thought, okay. But I just found that a really nice experience, because it allowed people to bring up what they wanted to bring up. You had a...
Yeah, my aunt's husband died. She did something that I thought was really smart. She actually told everybody, "I'm not making any decisions for a year," because her kids kept telling her, "You should move, you should do this, you should do that." And you're not in the right mind to decide anything.
Yeah. So that's a... Am I still on? Yeah. Not making any major decisions right away. And so often the family will say, sell the house and you get rid of this and do this and do that. And you're not really ready to think about what would you really like to do. So think about the mourning process. Is what is happening is you're trying to get into this new, I'm in a different life. So I was part of a partnership and now I'm single. I used to let the other person make the decisions. Now I have to make the decision. So you're entering into this new territory. And time is really helpful to give yourself time and space to figure that out. I remember one lady in my parish who had never driven the car because her husband would not let her. And now that he was gone, her daughter took her out and she learned how to drive. And she was like, "Pastor, I'm driving." I said, "Let me know what day you're on the road." I'm staying home. But it's that moving into what is now. And that takes time, and you have to weigh things, and you have to make decisions. So with my mother and the finances and her not really knowing, she reached out to my sister, who was a financial whiz like my dad. And so that's how that worked. My sister looked at everything and told Mom what she had and what she could do. And so again, that was one thing that kind of helped her move forward. But we're reinventing ourselves, aren't we?
What happens, I have a hard time if somebody dies and you know they're not Christian. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's hard for me then to give good, positive feelings.
Yeah.
And say positive things to this person.
So somebody dies that you know and maybe had a friendship with, and you know that they didn't believe, and so you cannot offer that comfort about the future. So I think many of us know people and have people in our circle who fit into that. So you can't do anything about that. What you can do is, again, be with them in their grief. So what I would encourage you to do is still be a friend, still go and have coffee, still ask them, how's it going? What's been hard for you? So let them tell you where they are and what's going on with them. And nobody knows, but if you befriend them and love them, they may come to the point where they say, tell me what you believe. So something may happen there. But just because they don't have that, that doesn't mean you can't stop loving them. That's what I want to encourage all of you to think about. Because we often think, well, okay, they're not believers, so then you just kind of, let that one go. Those are the folks that really need somebody to be there. And really in the hospital, we have quite a bit of that. There was a death, I think it was just this week, and the gentleman had died, and his daughter was there, and when I came in, she said, I don't really believe in anything, but you're welcome to come in. So I went in, and then she was talking about her dad, and then she said, my mom died in 2006, so that's 18 years ago. And she said, now that my dad's dying has brought back my mother's dying, and all the things that I never really resolved with that. So that had left her hanging, and 18 years she's carrying that, and so now she wants to bring some of that out and talk about that. So I couldn't talk to her about the afterlife, but I could talk to her about her pain and her struggle to find some meaning and some purpose in what was happening with her. So that's how I operate. I'm going to work with you on what is on your heart right now. And then we'll see. We'll see where that goes. That maybe she goes home, maybe she calls up and says, is that chaplain still there? I want to talk to him some more. But I just want you to take advantage of the opportunities that you do have.
Blessed with, I go to church at St. John's in Landon, and we have a grief share program there, and it really helped me to go through the steps and to be with other people that have lost, because you start to wonder, what I'm going through, is this normal? Am I, and just to be with other people and realize, oh, this is part of the process.
Yeah.
And that, I can feel good one day and all of a sudden fall to pieces the next.
Absolutely.
It's all part of the grief process.
Grieving is a very crazy process. And like you say, one day you're great, and the very next day you're in pieces. And then you start to kind of berate yourself, like, I thought I was over it. Well, what do you mean over? Because again, it is a process. It just kind of keeps going. We're downsizing, and as we were cleaning stuff out, there was a box in my closet that has been there since we moved in 1986. And nobody had ever really opened it. And so Jean and the kids are opening it. And what they found was a guest book and cards from our farewell. And that was 1986, so 38 years. And I started looking through the cards. And I started looking at the names in the guest book. And I was grieving. I was crying. And I thought, well, it's not over, is it? Those people were just as real to me now as they were when I saw them in the pew and when I sat in their houses. And many of them are gone, but the grief was still very present. And that didn't upset me. That didn't make me say, oh, come on, Steve, crying out loud, I thought you had it together. But it wasn't about that. I've got it together, but I also, this was 15 years of my life. And I'm not going to say that that never happened. That is a part of who I am. So each one of you, you want to, do that same thing with your grief. It is part of who you are. Yeah.
I think there's things that trigger it too, like you hear a song, or this was a song they sang at my mom's funeral.
Yeah.
Then it brings back
Those triggers. And, to me, that is one of the most difficult things about grief is I never know what the triggers are going to be. I didn't know they were going to open that box. I didn't know that I was going to pick up that guest book. And then boom, so that was the trigger. I think about my sister and I too, that every time we get together, we are talking about our growing up. We are talking about mom and dad. And it's old ground. Man, we have plowed that field 100 times. And yet, every time we plow it again, what happens? Something new comes up. And I just was thinking about that recently, how incredible that is. You think, well, we talked about this. But then there'll be one more detail that wasn't mentioned in that previous conversation that I hadn't heard before. So what's happened with me, and I think with my sister, is as we've talked about that, it has changed our perception and our understanding of our parents. So I've talked to you about, my dad criticizing my cultivating. And so, again, that was a thing in our relationship, one of the things that made me say, I'm not going to stay on the farm. I don't know where I'm going, but I got to go somewhere. And so really picking the ministry was almost kind of grasping at straws. I could always be a pastor. And there was not really a lot of thought there. There was not really an understanding of, well, what does that mean? Or what is that life like? I had no way of knowing. And then you get into the 12 years of education, and there were many times along that road where I'm saying, man, I don't know. This is an awful lot of school. And then I still don't know, is this really going to be it? And so somehow, through all of that, it did work out. But it could very easily have gone another way. And I could have said to myself, I should have been a mechanic. I wouldn't have had to go to school for 12 years to learn how to fix a car. So, there were other paths that could have been taken there. But as I'm doing this grief work with my sister, I start to see my father as she saw him and experienced him, as other people saw him and experienced him. And I realized that my perception needed to be bigger. So the result of that grief work is that I see my father for everything that he was. Not just that one little thing that really irked me and got under my skin. So when I see that totality, I love my father a lot more now than I did when I left the farm. My sister loves her mother much more than when she left the farm and disappointed my mother by not going to college and all those kind of things. So again, you can see how the process of talking and revisiting and going over things makes you see things that you didn't see before, makes you understand things, makes you change your mind. Any of you had that experience, that you feel differently about a person that has left you for a long time? Give that some thought. So another thing I want to say about grieving, we were talking about this before, how people grieve very differently. I went to a workshop where they talked about there are people who grieve by talking, and there are people who grieve by doing. So that's kind of an interesting distinction to think about. And so there may be this guy who goes down in his workshop, and he's making wood furniture and all kinds of stuff. But really what he's doing is working out his grief by making things, by being able to give these things to the people around him. He, again, is able to express himself through his hands rather than with his mouth. And then there are people who like to talk. And again, sometimes that's not easy, is it? If you got people who love to talk, that may mean that they go on for more than what your interest and your ability to stay focused is. So I have conversations sometimes with people who they never take a breath. And I'm kind of amazed, like, how do you do that? So I can only talk so long, I got to take a breath, but man. And then they just kind of go, and then they're one tangent, and then that tangent, and then, so I'm trying to say, okay, where are we? Because you're just kind of all over the map. So when you're in that kind of a conversation, I do have times where I have to say to people, I'm sorry, but I got some more people I have to see today. So why don't we stop here and we'll pick it up when I come back the next time. So hold that thought. So you have to also understand your own ability to be present and how much energy you have and how much you're able to enter in there. And if you can't, don't try to fake it, because you're going to get caught if you do that. So any other thoughts that you have on the talking and the doing, the different ways that people process their grief?
Say that in my experience, there's a vast difference when you're contemplating someone else's issues as to what you would recommend. But in my life, everything looks very different when you're face to face with whatever the issue is.
Yep. It is very different when it's your reality, isn't it? And so again, another aspect here I'd like to talk about is that giving advice, telling people what to do. If you are talking with someone in their grief, I advise you don't do that. They've already had umpteen people telling them what they should do. As we were talking before, you should sell the house, you should do this, you should do that. You should be doing better. You shouldn't be crying so much. You should be getting out more. You should go dancing. There's a lot of shoulds out there, aren't there? So I think the most helpful thing you can do is do not give advice. And most people are going to find that refreshing. And they may even say to you, it's really remarkable. You're the only person that hasn't told me what to do. And you say, yeah, how about that? Now, one of the most valuable things you're doing by not giving them advice is what are you saying to them by not doing that?
make the decision for themselves.
You're trusting them to make the decision for themselves. There is a wise young man. That is awesome. You are absolutely right about that. You know that they have the ability. They feel like a mess. They feel like they're out of control. They feel like the world is just in pieces. And you're looking at them and saying, yeah, this is hard, isn't it? But you are going to figure it out. And the amazing thing, as people are talking and you're listening, is that they do. I don't know how many times people have said to me, you know, I just got a thought. And I think, you know, this is maybe what I want to do. And I'm like, hey, all right. And then I take the advice that I had and just kind of leave it in my pocket because it wasn't nearly as good as what they had figured it out. But they do have to figure it out, don't they? One way or the other, they've got to put it together. And your supporting and listening is a very important part of helping them to do that.
And when you give advice, I think it can feel too like you're pushing them off, you know?
Yep.
Not instead of being there with them.
Yep, absolutely. And that's what you're doing. I just see that all the time, that when people give advice, that is also their exit line. So like, okay, this is what you need to do, bye. And it's hard to stay present because you may be crying too. And so many times people will say, well, I can't allow myself to cry because I have to be strong. So the patient will say, I don't want my kids to see me crying. And I'm saying, why not? Because if they see you crying, then they know that you love them. And they know that you don't want to leave them. So now you're letting that come out. But if you fake it and hold the tears in, then the kids are saying, doesn't bother her that she's leaving us behind. She can't wait to get away from us. So, you know, again, people draw conclusions that may not be true. So let the emotions come out and be present. Was there another hand anywhere? Okay, so we're just about at 10:15. So we'll pick it up from here next week, and we've got another half hour here. So do some more thinking about experiences you've had, things that you've tried, things that worked, things that didn't work, and bring those next week. See you next Sunday.